1878. A child was born in the small town of Gori, Georgia. No one predicted he would eventually control 1/6 of the Earth's surface. Joseph Stalin did not rise through luck. He used robbery, exile, and underground politics to climb the Bolshevik ranks. How did a shoemaker's son become a Red Tsar? He was a bureaucrat. He turned paperwork into a weapon of absolute power. The footage from the era shows the result. Thousands of men in uniform marching in perfect lines. Mass rallies filled the squares of Moscow. But behind the parades, the reality was different. Stalin enforced a policy of total liquidation. He didn't just arrest his enemies, he erased their names from history books and touched up official photographs to remove their faces. Starvation became a state tool. In the 1930s, grain was seized from the peasants at gunpoint. Millions died in the fields of Ukraine and southern Russia. The sound of empty grain silos and the sight of skeletal families defined the decade. It wasn't a natural disaster, it was a calculated strike against the people. There was no mistake. The Gulag system expanded across the Siberian permafrost. Barbed wire fences stretched for thousands of miles. Prisoners dug canals with hand tools in sub-zero temperatures. Guards followed a simple rule: work or die. Stalin monitored the death tolls from his desk in the Kremlin. He signed execution lists by the thousands, often while drinking wine late into the night. But this was only the beginning. He purged his own military commanders. He replaced experienced generals with loyal puppets. When the German army invaded in 1941, the Soviet defense collapsed. Stalin froze. For several days, he locked himself in his dacha and refused to speak. He waited for his subordinates to arrest him. Instead, they asked him for orders. Events accelerated. The war ended with Soviet flags over Berlin. Stalin was at the height of his influence, controlling half of Europe. But paranoia grew with his age. He suspected his doctors. He suspected his inner circle. He planned a new wave of terror that would dwarf the previous ones. At first glance, he was an immortal god of the proletariat. But in reality, he was a dying man on a bathroom floor. March 1, 1953. Guards found Stalin lying in his own urine at the Kuntsevo dacha. He had suffered a massive stroke. For hours, no one called a doctor. His advisors stood over him, watching him struggle for breath. They were too afraid to help him, and too hopeful that he would die. The camera records the funeral, a sea of people weeping in the streets. Some were crushed to death in the crowd. They cried for the man who had destroyed their families. The body was placed in the mausoleum next to Lenin. The story cut off here. The era of the Iron Man was over. December 18, 1878. On this day, Ioseb Jughashvili was born in the small town of Gori. At that time, Georgia was not an independent state. It was a province of the Russian Empire. How did a peasant boy become a dictator? He was born into a world of dirt and violence. He had no money and no status. His father worked as a shoemaker. He spent his earnings on drink. The man was a violent alcoholic who regularly beat his wife and his young son. In the frame, a small, dark house with a dirt floor. The sound of heavy footsteps and shouting was a daily occurrence. Stalin grew up with the constant smell of cheap vodka and the sight of his mother's bruises. The footage from the archives shows a harsh landscape. His mother was a deeply religious woman. She had a specific plan for her son. She sent him to a local church school. She wanted him to wear the robes of a priest. But Stalin chose a different path. In 1894, he entered the Tiflis Theological Seminary. He studied the Bible by day. He read banned revolutionary texts by night. The contradiction could not last. In 1899, the seminary leadership took action. They expelled the young man. The official reason was his failure to attend exams, but the real reason was clear. He was caught spreading Marxist propaganda among the students. He didn't just leave the building, he turned his back on the church entirely. This was the breaking point. There was no turning back. The expulsion ended his religious education. It started his life as a professional revolutionary. He swapped the prayer book for the manifesto. He moved into the underground world of shadows, secret meetings, and illegal printing presses. Thus began the rise of the man the world would eventually know as Stalin. 1901. This year marked the beginning of Joseph Stalin's rise within the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party. He chose his side immediately. He joined the Bolsheviks, a radical faction commanded by Vladimir Lenin. The work was violent and illegal. Stalin did not just talk about revolution. He organized massive industrial strikes, coordinated armed bank robberies, and ran underground printing presses for illegal propaganda. The Tsar's police tracked his movements. They arrested him multiple times and sent him into the frozen depths of Siberia. Each time, he escaped or returned. These years in exile did not break him. They hardened his resolve. 1912. He abandoned his birth name and adopted a new identity, Stalin. In Russian, it means man of steel. He began writing for Pravda, the official Bolshevik newspaper. His writing was dry and functional. Unlike Leon Trotsky, Stalin was not a natural orator. He lacked charisma. He didn't move crowds with fiery speeches, but he possessed something else: political ruthlessness and extreme patience. October 1917. The Bolsheviks seized power in a violent coup. Stalin did not lead the charge on the streets, but he secured a seat in the new government. 5 years later, in 1922, Lenin appointed him General Secretary of the Communist Party. At the time, the role appeared to be a dead-end clerical job. It was a position for a bureaucrat, not a leader. But Stalin saw a path to absolute control. He spent his days at a desk, filing papers and making appointments. He placed his loyalists in every regional office. He gathered secret files on every rival. He used blackmail, wiretapping, and intimidation to build a private network of informants. He turned the party's administration into his own personal weapon. Lenin watched from his sickbed. He grew suspicious of the man he had promoted. By late 1922, Lenin wrote a secret document known as his testament. He was blunt. He warned the party that Stalin was too rude and too dangerous. He explicitly ordered the party leaders to remove Stalin from his post. But Lenin was dying. A series of strokes paralyzed his body and took his voice. In January 1924, Lenin died. Stalin acted immediately. He used his administrative power to suppress the testament. He ensured the warning was never read to the party Congress. He stayed in his office. He kept his files. The warning was buried. The path to the top was clear. January 1924. Lenin was dead. Most observers expected Leon Trotsky to take the throne, but Joseph Stalin had a different plan. He stayed in the shadows and began a systematic hunt for absolute power. He did not fight alone at first. Stalin formed a political alliance with Grigory Zinoviev and Lev Kamenev. Their goal was simple: destroy Trotsky. They stripped him of his military titles and pushed him to the margins of the party. By 1929, the man who built the Red Army was forced onto a boat and sent into permanent exile. Who was next? The answer was his own allies. Stalin turned his sights on Zinoviev and Kamenev. He accused them of factionalism and treason. The party expelled them. The archives show a clear pattern. Stalin used fabricated charges, public humiliation, and secret executions to erase every rival. By 1928, the process was complete. Stalin held absolute control over the Communist Party. He ruled the Soviet Union with a single signature. But power was not enough. He wanted a total transformation of the state. That same year, Stalin launched the first 5-year plan. It was a massive economic experiment. The goal was to turn a poor, agrarian nation into an industrial superpower. He demanded steel, coal, and heavy machinery at any cost. To fuel the factories, Stalin needed 2 things: food and labor. He decided the state must own every grain of wheat. This was the beginning of the end for the Russian countryside. Events accelerated. Stalin turned his attention to the peasants. He forced millions of farmers to hand over their private land, their livestock, and their tools to the state. These were the kulaks. They had worked these fields for generations. The footage from the era shows the result: soldiers seizing grain at gunpoint. Stalin did not see people, he saw obstacles. He labeled the kulaks greedy enemies of the state. Their crime was owning a few more cows or a slightly larger plot of land than their neighbors. He told the public they were blocking progress. There was no turning back. The campaign to destroy the farmers had begun. Millions of lives were now on the line. 1929. This was the year Joseph Stalin declared war on his own peasantry. He needed an excuse to crush the independent farmers, and he found one in the concept of class struggle. The state seized private land by force. Authorities herded families into massive government-run collective farms. They called this process collectivization. It was a mandatory transition. Anyone who hesitated was labeled a traitor to the revolution. The countryside immediately erupted into chaos. Farmers did not want to hand over their property. They chose to slaughter their own cattle and burn their barns rather than give them to the state. Grain production collapsed. People had no incentive to work land they no longer owned. But Stalin did not admit failure. At first glance, a policy error, but in reality, a deliberate purge. He blamed the farmers for the food shortages. He accused them of hoarding grain and sabotaging the Soviet economy. The response was brutal. The footage from that era shows soldiers hauling families out of their homes. Stalin ordered mass arrests and executions. In 1929 alone, police deported more than 100,000 so-called kulaks to labor camps. Thousands died in freezing cattle cars during transportation. Others were shot on the spot. Families were torn apart. Guards separated children from their parents. Entire villages were emptied in a single night. This was the start of de-kulakization. It was a campaign for total control, not just economic reform. There were no trials. There were no second chances. Once the state labeled a man a kulak, his life was over. But this was only the beginning. The Soviet state still demanded massive grain exports. Stalin needed the money to fund heavy industry and military growth. Food shortages spread across the provinces. Experts and local officials sent urgent warnings to Moscow. Stalin ignored them. He chose to export food while his own people began to starve. The sound of grinding machinery in the cities drowned out the screams in the villages. Events accelerated. The state took every last seed from the silos. There was no turning back. Thus began the destruction of the Soviet peasantry. 1932. The Soviet state demanded grain that did not exist. When local villages failed to meet these impossible quotas, Stalin sent the Red Army to take everything by force. Soldiers arrived in trucks. They carried rifles and iron rods to probe the earth. How did a fertile land become a graveyard? The answer was simple. Stalin used hunger as a weapon of war. It was not a natural disaster. It was a calculated liquidation. Homes were raided from cellar to attic. Storage barns were swept clean until not a single kernel remained. Families watched as soldiers loaded their last bags of wheat onto carts. People were left with empty plates and no seeds for the next season. This was the Holodomor. Between 1932 and 1933, millions of Ukrainians starved to death in their own homes. It stands as one of the most brutal chapters in Soviet history. The famine was the direct result of Stalin's push for total collectivization. He wanted to break any form of resistance. Ukraine was the primary target. The region was known for its black soil and rich farmland. Its people held a strong sense of cultural identity and independence. Ukrainian farmers refused to surrender their land to the state. They killed their own livestock rather than hand it over to collective farms. They hid grain in secret pits. In Stalin's eyes, this was not just disobedience. It was a rebellion against the revolution. He decided to crush the peasantry entirely. In late 1932, the quotas increased again. The numbers were mathematically impossible to achieve. When the grain did not arrive, the food requisition brigades moved in. These were armed groups authorized to use any means necessary. The footage from the era shows the process. Brigades went from house to house. They tore up floorboards and knocked down walls to find hidden jars of seeds. They confiscated even the smallest scraps of food. If a farmer was caught hiding a handful of grain, the penalty was immediate. They were either executed on the spot or loaded onto cattle cars for deportation to labor camps. At first glance, it was a policy of grain collection, but in reality, it was an organized genocide. The sound of dogs barking and boots on wooden floors became the soundtrack of the countryside. Resistance became impossible. There was no way out. The state seized the food. The people died where they stood. August 7, 1932. Joseph Stalin signed a decree that the starving population called the Law of Spikelets. It targeted everyone. A child picking up a handful of grain from a collective farm field was now a state enemy. The penalty was 10 years in a labor camp or death by firing squad. Desperation was no defense. The law viewed a hungry peasant the same as a professional thief. Even a few stalks of wheat were classified as socialist property. Guards moved into the fields with rifles. They watched from wooden towers. By the winter of 1932, the famine reached a breaking point. Entire regions in Ukraine ran out of flour, vegetables, and livestock. Stalin reacted by turning the republic into a prison. He issued orders to seal the borders. The Soviet secret police blocked the roads. They stopped every train. Soldiers turned back thousands of starving families trying to reach the cities. Stalin also rejected all foreign assistance. When international organizations offered shipments of grain, the Kremlin denied there was a crisis. The death toll climbed. Modern records confirm at least 3.9 million Ukrainians died during the Holodomor. Some historians argue the actual figure exceeds 7 million. The math of the tragedy is visible in the census data. Entire villages vanished from the map. The silence in the countryside was absolute. There were no dogs barking or birds singing. People had eaten them all. Survivors described the taste of boiled leather belts and ground tree bark. They ate grass until their stomachs swelled. The reports became darker. In isolated districts, local officials documented cases of cannibalism. Human meat was sold in hidden markets. Parents watched their children die and lost their minds. Stalin was not in the dark. He sat in the Kremlin and read the daily reports. He knew the exact number of corpses being cleared from the streets of Kharkiv and Kiev. Yet he refused to lower the grain quotas. He did the opposite. He sent in more brigades to seize what little remained. He called the starving peasants saboteurs. He accused them of hiding food to spite the Soviet state. While millions perished, the Soviet Union exported grain to the West to buy industrial machinery. The grain ships left the ports of Odessa while the docks were lined with bodies. The state took the food. The people took the blame. It was a planned collapse. Official propaganda reported total success. The plan worked. Rural Ukraine was being systematically erased from the map. Then came December 1, 1934. This date changed the Soviet Union forever. Sergei Kirov was the Communist Party leader in Leningrad. He was charismatic and popular. Many officials saw him as a legitimate rival to Joseph Stalin. Suddenly, Kirov was dead. An assassin shot him in the hallway of a government building. The details were suspicious immediately. Kirov had recently challenged Stalin's policies during party meetings. On the day of the hit, his usual security detail was missing. The hallways were empty. Many historians now reach the same conclusion. Stalin either ordered the hit or intentionally left the door open for the killer. He needed a pretext. Why did Kirov have to die? Stalin needed a reason to liquidate his enemies. Kirov's death provided the perfect fuse. Within hours, Stalin signed new emergency decrees. These laws gave the NKVD secret police absolute power. They could now arrest any citizen without presenting evidence. They could execute prisoners without a trial or a defense attorney. This was the birth of the Great Purge. Some called it the Great Terror. At first, the arrests were targeted. By 1936, the violence exploded. It became a systematic political crackdown. The numbers are staggering. Between 1936 and 1938, the regime arrested over 1,500,000 people. The process followed a grim routine. Black cars arrived at apartment blocks in the middle of the night. NKVD officers broke down doors. They took fathers, mothers, and teachers. At first glance, these were criminals, but in reality, they were ordinary citizens. The reasons for arrest were trivial. A worker could be taken for arriving 10 minutes late to a factory shift. A student could disappear for telling a joke about Stalin's mustache. Neighbors denounced neighbors to steal their rooms. Once the heavy steel doors of the Lubyanka prison closed, there was no escape. The footage from the era is haunting. Lines of exhausted prisoners stand against cold stone walls. Inside the interrogation rooms, the sound of rhythmic beating never stopped. Guards used sleep deprivation, starvation, and physical torture. They wanted names. They wanted confessions to imaginary crimes. There was no mistake. The goal wasn't justice. It was total submission. The prisoners eventually signed anything placed in front of them. They confessed to being spies for Japan or saboteurs for Germany. They admitted to crimes they didn't understand. These signed papers were the only evidence the state required. The Great Terror had reached its peak. 700,000 executions. That was the official tally by the end of 1938. But the process began much earlier with a series of scripted performances. Why did innocent people confess to crimes they never committed? The answer was simple: terror. The Soviet state organized elaborate show trials. Every participant had a role. The judges, the defense lawyers, and the defendants followed a pre-written script. The accused stood in the dock and admitted to being spies, traitors, and enemies of the people. The footage shows men with hollow eyes reciting their sins. They didn't do it willingly. Interrogators used a specific leverage. They threatened to arrest wives and execute children. Some prisoners were promised their lives in exchange for a confession. It was a lie. Once the signature was on the paper, the guards led them to the basement. A single shot to the back of the head ended the process. In 1937, the pace of the killings accelerated. Nearly 400,000 people were executed in those 12 months alone. Events moved quickly. The state did not stop at the accused. They targeted the families. Children of the arrested were officially labeled offspring of enemies of the people. NKVD agents removed them from their homes. Some went to state orphanages. Others, even teenagers, were sent directly to labor camps. But this was only the beginning. Stalin turned his attention toward the Red Army. He targeted the elite. Marshal Mikhail Tukhachevsky was one of the most respected commanders in the Soviet Union. NKVD agents arrested him and other top military leaders. They were tortured and shot. In a few months, half of the entire officer corps was gone. They were either dead or sitting in prison cells. The result was a disaster. The Soviet military became a hollow shell, disorganized and leaderless. This happened only a few years before the start of World War II. By the end of 1938, the numbers were staggering. 700,000 dead. Millions more disappeared into a system of shadows. Those who escaped the firing squad faced the Gulag. This was a vast network of forced labor camps. These sites were not hidden. They stretched across the entire Soviet Union. The locations were chosen for their brutality. The Arctic Circle, the frozen wastes of Siberia, the remote forests of the Far East. In these camps, the temperature dropped to -40 degrees. Prisoners worked with primitive tools in the snow. At first glance, it was a prison system. But in reality, it was an industry of death. The sound of pickaxes hitting frozen earth was constant. Guards watched from wooden towers. There was no escape. Most who entered the Gulag system were never heard from again. The Great Purge had reached its peak. The era of the Red Terror was complete. Gulag, short for Glavnoye Upravlenie Lagere, translated, the main administration of camps. Stalin's secret police managed the entire system. Stalin transformed these camps into a weapon. He used them to eliminate anyone suspected of opposition. 1939. By this year, the population behind barbed wire reached 1.3 million. Throughout Stalin's reign, the numbers grew. Estimates show more than 18 million men, women, and children entered the system. This was an entire shadow nation. Criminals were only a small part of the population. The camps held teachers, doctors, and engineers. Students and peasants slept on the same wooden bunks. Life inside was a machine for breaking humans. Prisoners performed grueling physical labor. They mined coal. They cut timber in frozen forests. They built railroads across swamps and dug massive canals. Tools were primitive. Often, men dug frozen earth with only pickaxes and shovels. They worked 12 to 16 hours every day. The environment was lethal. Food was a tool of control. Rations were tiny. A piece of bread and thin soup was the daily standard. If a worker failed to meet his quota, the guards cut his food. Hunger became a constant physical pain. Medical care did not exist. Public executions and beatings served as warnings. The guards used violence to ensure silence and obedience. But the weather was the most efficient killer. In Kolyma and Vorkuta, the mercury dropped. Temperatures hit -50 degrees Celsius. The archival footage shows the result. Frozen limbs, bodies stacked like cordwood. Frostbite was a daily reality for every prisoner. There was no escape from the cold. The system was designed to work them until they collapsed.